Hello, welcome to Reviews. Today I want to have a look at one of the most widely accepted and deeply held beliefs in the UX industry, and I want to turn it on its head. This is an idea I have called inversion, and let's start with looking at one of the topmost beliefs, and that's Nielsen's heuristics, mainly aesthetic and minimal design. So right off the bat, aesthetic and minimal design, bundling aesthetic and minimal together. Why does it have to be that way? Clearly, it's possible to have something that is aesthetically pleasing while also it not being minimal. Am I right? So if you look throughout antiquity, you see an example from India, Meenakshi Temple, or in Cambodia, Angkor Wat, or these other wonders of the world throughout antiquity, you will see these many examples. And of course, I'm being a bit cheeky here. These heuristics are written from a usability standpoint. So the design of tools and services used to accomplish particular tasks. And in that sense, it makes perfect sense to get rid of the excessive ornamentation if it interferes with the goal, if the successful completion of the task versus failure of the task is at hand. On the NN Group, Nielsen and Norman Group website, they've given a small picture with a functional teapot and an ornate teapot, and they say the excessive ornamentation of this teapot may interfere in the goal of being able to serve tea, whereas the functional teapot has this handle and the spout and all these things that will be better when it comes to usability, which point of course taken. You see, the issue that I have with this laser focus on minimalism is when it bleeds into the other aspects of life. Now, as UXers, I know I have at least been there. When I first got into this field, I read the books, Design of Everyday Things and Don't Make Me Think, and all these basic books that we read, the ABCs of our business. And you start looking at everything around you. At least I started looking at everything around me through that lens of design and usability. And every time I came across something that I didn't feel like was good design, I used to say like, hey, that's bad design. Especially parking structures or parking garages, for example, getting in and out of those multi-story garages. I'm definitely always confused by that, and I used to go, hey, that's bad design. It's like a toddler when they learn a new word, for example, like a child or toddler learns dirty as a concept of clean versus dirty, and they just start pointing, that's dirty, that's dirty. That's exactly what happens. And that's just a completely natural thing that happens for every new UXer that's out there, and I'm not calling everybody out in that sense, but you get my point. And like I mentioned, many things in the world are badly designed, so to speak, when you think about it from the lens of usability and user experience design. But in many cases, it becomes a tribalistic shaming of certain things. An example from my own life, I'll just give that. My mother loves having a house full of different stuff. So she has all sorts of collections, books, small trinkets, statues, things like that. And she loves collecting those things, and every change of the season or based on every festival, she'll pull out certain collections and put them in the different corners of the house throughout the year. And it's a very involved process for her. So think about the process. So taking the things out of the boxes, putting them in the particular spots, specific spots according to the theme, and making those collections visible around the house, and making sure every corner of the house has something placed in it. And now, as a kid growing up, you're always rebellious and you want the complete opposite of what your parents want. There's one aspect of that. And the other aspect of me being new in the design world, I used to always think, I used to think about minimalism and all these things that I never got to really fully experience in my house. So it was my thought process that time. It was, this is very excessive and this is very unnecessary. It's very inefficient. It's a waste of time. And all of this is, well, bad design. But thinking back to it now, I realize that this is a very myopic mindset, looking at everything just through the lens of that, again, aesthetic and minimalist design. So like I mentioned, think about the process. It's a very involved process. She's not creating unnecessary ornamentation. That's not what she's doing. The whole process, like I mentioned, is for her delightful in and of itself. And speaking of delight, UXers are always chasing that holy grail of what's the delightful experience. How do we add delight to it? Like it's some ingredient that you can add into something at a later point. We talk about this all the time. We discuss it in every forum, internal conversations, whether it be work or any seminar or whatever, it always comes up. But the thing is that a lot of these things that bring joy to people are considered illogical or suboptimal or bad design when we look at it through the minimal lens. So now let's invert this. Let's think about maximalism, if that even is a word. Instead of thinking less is more, we think more is more. Wanting ornamentation, details, intricate details, filling every nook and cranny full of those things. And once you start thinking about these maximalist tendencies, you realize that around the world there are so many different cultures or different walks of life where maximalism is something that brings joy to a lot of people. I saw a short video on social media, I think it was TikTok, where somebody said, everybody talks about minimalism, but I'm poor. I came from a poor household, and for me, I want stuff in my house just to show how far I have come, and that will give me joy. There are cultural traditions. Let's come back to the example that NN Group puts on its website. They say this intricately ornate teapot is not usability wise the best compared to this functional one that has the ergonomic handle and the spout and all this. But you're thinking from the wrong point of view. You're thinking of it as just a tool to fulfill an objective. Task of pouring tea, achieving the objective. We're looking at it from the wrong point of view in this situation. Okay, fine, it's not the most usable, but think about the cultural background, think about the sentimental value that teapot has, think about the process surrounding it. It's not just a one and done thing. It's not just somebody takes the teapot and pours the tea and puts it back. It's a whole ceremony that surrounds the so-called ornate teapot that looks like kind of a traditional Chinese or traditional Japanese, traditional Indian teapots that we have at home. It's a whole cultural and social event around that, right? Tea holds that historical context. I would even go as far as to say that the minimalism as the only way for something to be aesthetically pleasing is a very Eurocentric way of looking at it, because it's very mid-century, the modernistic movement of minimalism that came from all these different design houses like the Bauhaus in Germany, and also they take some ideas from Japanese minimalism as well. So the Scandinavian and Japanese minimalism that are in vogue these days. But other than those two, there are so many cultures that are maximalist. I talked about the Meenakshi temple with its intricate carvings of the gods that all along the spire of the temple. That's not a minimalist thing, but it holds so much value to all of the people in that region. And in India, the dominant aesthetic sensibility is unapologetically maximalist, which brings me to the next point of kind of a controversial point, which is using minimalism as a cultural erasure. The stance that states minimalism is used by authoritarian regimes. So the fascist regime of the early 20th century, mid 20th century, to erase the cultural heritage and pave over it, create something new, something that is very functional, austere, and singular in its vision. And again, like I mentioned, mid-century, earlier 20th century, the backdrop of authoritarianism wanting to detach from the cultures of the past, that's something that we shouldn't be ignoring. And why shouldn't we be ignoring it? Because the field of UX has become so much more international than it used to be in the 90s and the early 2000s. We really need to go back and rethink the core tenets of our craft. Maybe I'm being too audacious and I'm painting everything with broad strokes, but I want to bring forth this conversation, which I don't think we are having to the extent that we should be having. We need to think about the overall context in which these rules, these heuristics and all these things had been codified. It was the early 90s, 1995, I believe, for the heuristics. And at that time, internet was very new, very few people had access to it. and the rules that were codified and at that time also bring together those contexts from that time, and it will be very Eurocentric, very American centric in that way. At that point, UX, user interfaces and user experiences and all these things were very new. They were in a nascent stage, and the creators as well as the end users were limited to those areas that I mentioned. So instead of shaming the maximalists or people who derive joy from maximalism, and of course I'm not saying you should take it to the extreme and the hoarders and they just have the obsessive compulsive disorder, all these things, let's not go into that, but let's try to see how we can understand the different cultural historical sensibilities and move our field forward in that sense. As always, my aim is always to create a conversation, and sometimes it appears a bit too audacious like I mentioned earlier, but there's no other way to start it. I believe this is my opinion. Again, these are my thoughts, and if there are experts in the fields like I mentioned, historical, cultural, UX is a great field that has all these different experts. I'd like to know and start this discussion with those knowledge points in mind. Thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and share these videos with these experts. I'd like to know everybody's thoughts on this. And remember, design is political. I'll see you next time.